So the European Union is struggling with Russia cutting off gas supplies to Germany and thus to much of the rest of the European Union. The UK, this has become a big issue in their politics. The Baltic states appear to be taking the worst of it. You've got 76% inflation right now in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania pushing into the 60s. What is Europe planning on doing about these energy prices and frankly, the energy crisis? And to what extent does interfering, to use a popular conservative word, interfering in the marketplace, that is to say, offering subsidies or price supports to consumers or actually directly inserting itself into the energy marketplace, what are the side effects of that? How does that work out? What's going on here with the European Union and energy prices, and how might it affect us here in the United States? On the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books, including The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, now available as an ebook, and the host of Economic Update with Professor Richard Wolff right here on Free Speech TV, democracyatwork.info, Prof. Wolff with 2 Fs on Twitter. Professor Wolff, welcome back. I'm wondering if you can fill us in on how the European Union is dealing with or hoping to deal with, or how they could best deal with this energy crisis that is probably going to, really earn that title crisis by the time it starts getting cold here and in the next few months.
Well, I'm afraid rather than dealing, I think the better word would be reeling. They don't know what to do. They're running around, spending half their time yelling, crisis, crisis, no heating oil in the winter, no gas to power our offices and stores and factories. They are in a major economic crisis, no question about it. They're going to be tested, each of the countries and the union they've tried to create with much difficulty. That looks like a daunting task, especially now that the new government in Britain is even worse on the question of demonizing Europe than Boris Johnson was during his time. So the unification process has at best been set back. Here is the basic issue, and there is no nice way to avoid it, even though much of the media is working hard to do it. It's not the war in in Ukraine that's the problem. It's the sanction package. It's the decision of the United States and many of its allies in Europe to punish Russia, or if you like U.S. Defense Secretary's words, weaken Russia as a response to get them either to withdraw their troops or to go back home or whatever it is they're thinking of getting. The Russians are clearly not about to do that, and the Russians turn out to have ways of coping with sanctions that were not anticipated. Let me remind everyone, President Biden and the top officials of this government, the leading bankers at J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, were all of one voice predicting that the Russian economy would collapse in a matter of weeks. These were things that were said in March and April as the sanctions program were announced. None of that has happened. Instead, the countries imposing sanctions saw that it took the inflations they already had and made them worse. And there's no really end of this. The Russians turned out to have other people to sell oil and gas to around the world. Most countries in the world either support Russia or are neutral. They are not siding with the West. We may be observing a visible crisis in what's happening in Europe because they're impacted first. They depended most on Russia and for oil and gas. They are seeing the prices of those at many multiples of what they were as little as 12 months ago. They are facing, therefore, a worse inflation and the coming cold winter. But behind the scenes of that visible, the invisible one, so far, ought to worry Americans, if anything, more, because it's a shift in the balance of power. What the West is able to impose, in this case, on Russia, turns out to be as ineffective as what the Trump regime tried to impose on China with the tariff wars and the trade wars that were called the mother of all sanctions when they were imposed, just like this current one is even bigger mother of sanctions imposed on Russia. If what has happened in the first 6 months is any indication that economic problems got worse in the countries that do the sanctioning than they did in the countries that were sanctioned, wow, then we are watching a much bigger crisis unfold, which is a real realignment of where the growth and strength of the world economy is and where it isn't.
So, regardless of the wisdom of imposing sanctions on Russia for their brutal slaughter of thousands of Ukrainians, completely without provocation. Setting that issue aside, how we should respond to it, this is the response that's happening. And, as you point out, the UK has got 10% inflation right now. The worst is Latvia, at 76%. What are the solutions with regard to energy prices that the Europeans are proposing to use, and what might be the consequences of those? Are we going to see, a continued inflation spike? What happens if governments come in and say, okay, we'll pay part of your energy bills? Does that just simply subsidize people to continue using larger quantities of energy than they should? On the other hand, if they start getting rolling blackouts, or they start asking people to dial back their thermostats, obviously there are political consequences to that. How does all this work out economically? We had this debate during the Nixon time with this wage and price controls. How does it? But that was here. How is this going to play out in Europe in your mind?
At this point, it's total chaos. I mean, one government says one thing. I mean, give you just a few examples. The German government is proposing to literally distribute 65 billion euros. That's about the same now as dollars to its people as a kind of generic, we're going to help you, we're going to help you, we're going to help you. Doesn't solve the problem, but it shows you how desperate politicians are literally grabbing around. In France, there's a rediscussion of whether they might open nuclear facilities or expand them. The Germans might reopen them. They were in the process of closing theirs. In Spain, they're washing their hands of the whole thing, hoping somehow, it's a mystery how, they're going to escape, I guess, by finding other sources of oil and gas. They weren't as reliant as other Europeans were on the Russians and so on. And then you have the Baltics, which are spinning out of control, and a British government that seems to want to pretend it has it all under control. They are threatening their people with lowering thermostats, with having interruptions in electric service for certain hours of the day. And you're right, Tom, they're also beginning to realize that they don't have many weapons, and the one they were going to use and are using, like here in this country, raising interest rates, is very bad for the same mass of the people that have been suffering from inflation. So they're not going to be happy with this added problem. You are really building up an explosion, and they don't know which way to go.
Yeah, well, keep an eye on this one. Professor Richard Wolff, always great talking with you. Thank you so much for dropping by today.
My pleasure.